Hello again. Welcome back to another video. In this video, we'll be talking about the writing process. Up until this point, we have discussed essay writing essentials. We've covered the structure of an essay, the purpose of an essay, and the various component parts of an essay. We've even discussed briefly a short answer response and how one may use that in lieu of an essay to communicate a more digestible, bite-sized piece of information without needing all of the detail that an essay provides. However, how does one produce an essay? Where does the writing come from? What does that process look like? This is something in ELA that we call the writing process. Obviously, it is a process by which we produce writing, but it's not as simple as sitting down and simply committing pen or pencil to paper. To become a competent, adept writer, we need to understand the writing process, and we need to understand how we can use it to maximize our effectiveness as writers and thereby communicators and thinkers. I think to fully understand this, we need some larger context. So I think it's important to discuss how ELA as an educational or pedagogical concept or umbrella is really divided into two different branches. So ELA, which again stands for English Language Arts, can be thought of as consisting of two main components. So let's imagine ELA as an umbrella, and underneath that umbrella are these two major components. On one hand, we have rhetoric and composition. So very briefly, generally, and perhaps even reductively, we can imagine that rhetoric refers to how one speaks and how one uses persuasion, and composition refers to how one writes and how one communicates through writing. We can think of rhetoric and composition as how one uses language. When I spoke of English Language Arts, I really was oriented more in a rhetoric and composition direction, thinking about how we can use language, whether it's English, Spanish, etc., to affect change in the world. This is where we would find more skill-based instruction in the rhetoric and composition area. The other aspect of English Language Arts is generally known as literary analysis. This branch of ELA is what you would do in what one would call a reading class. This is where we study different types of literary texts and even non-literary texts, such as nonfiction, in the interest of learning about the authors who wrote those texts, the author's historical, social, political, geographic, and so on and so forth context, and also how by analyzing these texts, we can learn about the human condition and what it means to live in the world. Literary analysis is not necessarily concerned with rhetoric and composition insofar as the goal is not to teach the student how to speak and write. Literary analysis sort of turns the microscope the other way and focuses on how other people read and write and even speak to produce change in the world. So rhetoric and composition is really providing the student with the toolkit necessary to use language in effective, competent ways, whereas literary analysis is more about using the toolkit to study extant pieces of writing, or again, visual texts, music, whatever the case may be, and unpacking those texts in order to learn about the authors and or their respective historical time periods. Generally, we can think of rhetoric and composition as what one would find in a writing class, and we can think of literary analysis as one might find in a reading class. In college, one will generally take intro-level composition courses designed to teach one how to write, which is where the essay structure and so on becomes very relevant. And in literary analysis, survey lit courses, one will generally learn how to read. In public school, one will generally have a reading class distinct from a writing class. In some cases, they may be integrated, but the tasks are usually discrete or at least taught in discrete ways, and then brought together when one is actually applying them. Why is this important to know? The reason that we want to make a clear distinction between rhetoric and composition and literary analysis is because the writing process deals more chiefly with rhetoric and composition. In the lit analysis classroom, there is not necessarily much emphasis on teaching the student how to write. If a student entering into college completes his or her intro-level composition courses, the assumption in the survey of lit class, which is taken after the fact, is that the student already knows how to write. So the professor is not going to spend too much time emphasizing good writing etiquette or habits, and instead is going to jump immediately into content. In order to get to this part, literary analysis, we must have a strong mastery of what it means to actually write an essay and to produce quality work. Because by the time we get to the lit analysis class, by the time we're actually applying these practices in more meaningful, rigorous ways, we're not going to have time to fool around and possibly make errors. So this is where the writing process comes in. We can think of composition theory, or what it means to teach composition, as having shifted away from what we would consider a product-oriented approach to a process-oriented approach. So again, recent years have seen the product-oriented approach give way to a process-oriented approach. What does this mean? What this means basically is that in the area of compositional instruction, ELA instructors are now less interested in the final product and more interested in the process through which the writer arrived at the final product. This might seem paradoxical. Why shouldn't we care about the final product? Isn't that what we're trying to produce? Isn't all of the work designed to create a competent, effective essay, text, or whatever the case may be, so that we can affect change in the world? Isn't that what we're after? While this is true, to get to that final product requires an extensive and many times recursive process through which one writes, drafts, revises, and edits in order to achieve that final product. The process-oriented approach when it comes to composition considers writing as a living, non-ending process. That quote-unquote final draft that you produce to turn into your teacher is not really final. If you were to let it sit for a week or two and then come back to it, you would invariably change something about it. You would erase a word here, add a comma or two there, perhaps even revise whole sections of it to reflect a different thesis statement or to provide different examples within the body of the essay. In this way, writing is never fixed. If an author were to see a novel that he or she wrote 20 years before, he or she would probably be either dissatisfied with it or highly interested in revising it. Writing is fluid, much in the way people are. The only way for a piece of writing to never change is for the author to never change. So this informs the writing process. We are putting emphasis on the student's ability to engage in a process-oriented approach, to produce writing that is not necessarily fixed, but rather fluid and liable to change and evolve. This evolution is exactly what allows writing to increase in quality. Imagine if we were never able to learn from our mistakes, never able to apply feedback to our work. Our writing would never improve, we would never see improvements in our own communication, and our cognition would suffer as a result. So, what are the steps of the writing process? Put simply, there are 5 major steps, and we'll go through these one by one. The first step is what is known as pre-writing. Obviously, as the name would suggest, it is everything done before actually writing. You might think that this means that pre-writing does not involve writing, or that writing is taken to be literally putting pen and pencil to paper, excuse me. But pre-writing can be very broad. Simply sitting at your desk and thinking about what to write can be pre-writing. Sitting at your desk and doodling on a piece of paper can also be pre-writing. Engaging in discourse or dialogue with someone else to discuss ideas and potential topics is pre-writing. Conducting research is pre-writing. Anything done to inform the drafting process is pre-writing. So let's try to be less restrictive in our thinking about this and instead be very broad. The second step of the writing process is known as drafting. This is when we take the content and material generated through pre-writing, whether that be through discussion, brainstorming, research, or pre-writing exercises, some of which we will explore in a future video, and then beginning to actually commit those ideas to paper into a rough draft form. This is what we mean by rough draft versus final draft. We are creating the essay, but it is not in a presentable, publishable state yet. Once we have drafted our essay, we then want to consider revising. Revising is when we look at the content and material of our essay and make decisions about what to keep and what to cut. A famous adage in writing is to, quote, kill your darlings. What this means is one never wants to be too self-satisfied with his or her own writing. The act of revision is about cutting and sculpting what remains of the draft into something that is stronger and oftentimes leaner, more muscular. Drafts can often be overdone. We write a lot. We commit the error of what's called purple prose, and we're extremely elaborative and illustrative, sometimes to the expense of the actual content. Revision gives us an opportunity to clean our writing up and to also, in some cases, provide stronger direction and guidance to our reader. Perhaps my thesis statement in my essay is not very clear. By revising, I can increase the clarity of my thesis statement, make it sharper, make it more specific, and therefore help my reader have a better time navigating the essay as a whole. The next part of the writing process is known as editing. When one edits, one is really cleaning up surface errors. These involve more mechanical concepts like grammar and syntax. At the point that one is editing, issues of content and material are not really relevant anymore. I've already decided what I want my essay to look like. I've decided what my main goal with the essay is. I've decided what my main examples and pieces of evidence are, and I've decided what my main takeaway is. I'm not interested in changing the content of my essay anymore, but rather smoothing out the rough edges so that it's more easily readable and accessible to my audience. Here is where I might touch on my grammar, ensure that my citations are in place properly, and make sure that my wording is clean and once again, accessible and easy to understand. So editing is about changing the surface, not the content. Revision would be focused on changing content and not surface. The final step of the writing process is publishing. This is when I have polished my essay or whatever I'm writing to as much as I feel comfortable with, and then submitting it to be read by my audience. This could be through a submission to an instructor. It could be publication in a literary journal, a newspaper, or an anthology. Even just publishing a blog online is an act of publishing. Anything that is written goes through these various steps in the writing process. Ideas are generated via pre-writing. They are structured and organized in the drafting phase. They are revised and edited to ensure accuracy, brevity, clarity, and so on. And finally, they are published so as to be read by an audience. Publishing, however, does not mean that the writing is fixed. Once again, even though the book that you hold in your hands might seem as though it's permanent and unchanging, in reality, the text is alive. There's a reason why when we read when we discuss a novel, for example, we speak in the present tense. The text is always occurring. It is never quite done. An author will look at his or her book once again and decide that changes could be made. In fact, it's not atypical for some writers to publish revisions of novels that are 10, 20, 30, even 40 years old. We usually find that writing is, again, this recursive process that is never quite done, and that very active revising and applying feedback necessitates re-engaging with the writing process. In the writing process, during, for example, the revising or editing stage, I might find that I want to modify my thesis statement or replace it altogether. By making that decision, I'm committing to returning to the pre-writing stage. Once I've pre-written, I then need to draft my new thesis statement. I need to generate new examples and pieces of evidence that will support that thesis statement. And then I need to revise once again to ensure that I'm confident, happy about the content I've produced. I then have to edit. And so throughout the process of writing any piece of text, I may find myself revisiting all of the stages of the writing process multiple times for the sake of producing a better piece of work. In this way, we want to think of the writing process as recursive, not linear. Linear speaks to a straight line. We move from one stage to the next and we never go back. Recursive speaks to a more circular process by which we may revisit steps in the writing process as necessary to produce the most competent, effective piece of writing that we can. I think to better illustrate this writing process, we might use another illustrative example that will hopefully help our more visual learners out. So let's consider a piece of gemstone. I think for this, we'll use a different color. Let's imagine that you are digging in the earth and you excavate a hunk of raw emerald, this being our emerald. Again, it's crude, but purposely so. It is not meant to be refined. It is not meant to be elegant. We can think of this gemstone as our raw material. So, raw material. When we pre-write and generate ideas for an essay, we are producing raw material. We are, figuratively speaking, excavating the depths of our inner mind, our unconscious mind, and we are drawing on our knowledge to produce material for the purposes of organizing our thoughts into something that is coherent and comprehensible to a reader. Again, writing is communication. This is the process by which we retrieve information from within ourselves and then convey it to the outside world. So our raw material, as you can see, is not presentable yet. It's misshapen, perhaps even ugly, and it needs to be put through a forging process to be presentable. Through that drafting process, we may produce a relatively clean-looking emerald that is nonetheless still unperfect. It has sharp edges here and sharp edges there, for example, that need to be refined and smoothed away. This would be our drafting process, the act of smoothing out our material. We are putting our material into order, but it is not quite cleaned up yet. The next step would be revising and editing, cleaning off and sanding away the rough edges so that our emerald is no longer misshapen and ugly, but rather orderly and beautiful. So in this case, we have a very clean looking emerald. And in fact, it's giving off sparkles. We've done away with the dirt. We've shined it. It's now something that one could see being bought. And in fact, we are now going to set this on a ring. Now, all you need to do is put a price tag on it, and you have successfully achieved publishing. So we've taken our raw material over here. We've smoothed it out through the drafting, revising, and editing process, and we end up with a presentable, orderly in some cases very aesthetically appealing emerald that we then set into a ring and sell to an audience. We are selling our ideas through the writing process to an audience in the hope that they are going to quote unquote purchase or buy our ideas and either change their behavior, feelings, or thoughts. The writing process, therefore, is critical to producing any type of writing, and we use it all the time, whether we know it or not. When you go to the grocery store, for example, you compile a list of items to buy. That is a form of pre-writing. When you want to produce a novel, you outline, you develop a character Bible, you do many different steps that require pre-writing strategies. You draft out the project, you seek feedback, you apply the feedback, you ultimately publish your work to be read to an audience. When students create slideshow presentations, they apply this same thought process. Research is necessary, the information must be organized and then structured in a comprehensible, competent way. And then finally, the information is published, released to the world so that the audience can benefit from the hard work of the writer. With this said, hopefully the writing process is now more understandable and comprehensible to you, and you have a greater understanding of how we can use the writing process to produce more efficient, effective pieces of writing. As always, I hope you took something away from this video, and I will see you in the next one.